Well, thank you for meeting with me today. So excited. And I was a primary teacher for several years, but now I'm moving to upper grade. I know about the 4 Ps for primary, but what does that look like in upper grades?
That's a great question, because there are a lot of things that stay the same and then a few things that you need to shift in your thinking as you're working with older students. So just like when you worked in kindergarten, it's the same when you're planning your units. You want to start with that purpose in mind, kind of have that backwards plan going on, and think about what it is that you want your students to know and do at the end of that unit or of that lesson. Okay, so same thing as you did before. So what's going to change for you now in 3rd grade are going to be your products and your perspectives. So the product is going to look very different as a 3rd grade teacher than it would have when you were a kindergarten teacher, where you would have, you know, maybe an end product where it's a shared writing piece or something that you're doing with guidance and support. Now they're going to be independently practicing those things. You're still going to want to keep all your same great teaching skills where you're modeling and showing exactly step by step kind of what they need to do, and breaking things down into manageable chunks. Your perspectives are going to be a little bit different, where before maybe you would have had picture books as the perspectives for a lot of things. Now you're going to be moving on up into those chapter books, core books. And then as far as the process, you're still going to go in the same way that you did before. You're still going to be using those skills, but at a different level. So things like critical reading, where before that might have been done as a shared activity, now students are going to be more responsible for doing that on their own. Keeping the critical reading going, obviously we talked about the modeling. Talk is going to be just as important in 3rd grade as it was in kindergarten. I think as kindergarten teachers we kind of know that they need to do a lot of things verbally and practice first. But in 3rd grade, it's the same thing. And in fact, that these guys would probably agree that continues on, that they need to practice what they want to say before they do it. Okay, so those 5 process streams: the critical reading, the talk, the modeling, the synthesis, and the inquiry. So you're going to want time for them to have choice in what they're doing and follow their passions in what they're learning. And then also time for them to kind of put all of that learning together. So you're going to want to build that into your map as you're going, and have time for all of those higher level skills to kind of really work out.
You mentioned about core novels. And so what's the difference between core novel and guided reading?
So when you're thinking about your core novels, you're thinking about giving the kids access to the grade level reading that they're having. And then when you think about the guided reading, that's working on the strategies and the skills, and you might be having more small group, and it'll be at the level that the students are actually reading.
So if the core novel is too difficult for some of my students, what should I do?
You can think about some scaffolding that would kind of guide them. Some of the ideas that you might think of, providing the kids with chapter summaries ahead of time. You could also give them some pre-annotated, pre-annotated versions of the text as they're, to get them ready for that. So that's an option that you can use.
Are there suggestions if my students have already read the core novel?
Oh, that's a big one. I know. It's like, I already read Charlie. I already read Charlotte. And then, the kids will get upset. But think of it as like, each time, like when you read with a new teacher, you're reading through a new lens, so they can read through a new lens. Maybe I'm reading it for ideas, or one of the gate icons that we kind of talked about, so you can incorporate that. You can also even think of like an author study, so maybe they can read other books by the same author and extend it. Best of all, we don't want them to just say, oh, just because you read it already, then you're done, because there's always more to dig in and find out.
Heather, I think you had some really good ideas for how to differentiate.
Yeah, just building on what Taylor said, I think that you can always if the student has already read the book before, have them read another book that the author has written, and for comparison, or a book that has a similar theme, so they can kind of dig deeper and analyze both of them together. You can differentiate the depth and complexity icons that you have the students focus on as they analyze the text and read through the text, and how they respond using those icons. So that's another way.
And I'm so glad that you asked about incorporating core novels and guided reading, because really our goal is balanced literacy. We want to make sure that we're including access to those grade level texts, but still making sure that we're ensuring students are learning those skills and strategies within guided reading groups to be able to kind of bridge that gap. So there's teacher modeling, and then there's teacher support, and then there's independent reading as well for students to be able to focus on.
And one thing that I want to add about English learners is you may have some students who are brand new to the country and are fluent in their first language. If they are literate in their first language, possibly you could find the book, a core novel, in their home language. And that way then they can follow along and they can still participate adequately and get that depth of understanding. Still provide all the great resources like Sheila was talking about with the annotations, and possibly like an intro that gives them an overview in English. But because English is not their native language, you might be able to provide that support through the primary language and still enrich the experience of the student with the only language you speak, English.
That's a great idea.
That's a
Can
lot
I
of
add
fun.
one more
Oh,
thing?
yeah.
Sorry.
Uh-huh.
And then I love what you just said, Lori, because then there's also even, some books have graphic novel versions of them. So even for the student who has read the book before, just having a different, you're tapping into their interest perhaps, or, or providing a student who's newer to the country, another access point.
So with all this talk about core novels, how about the textbook? I know we just recently adopted a new textbook for the next school year. And so I was wondering, how do I use my new textbook with my upper grade students?
There's actually something in the back of the first unit. They're called standard correlations. And at the back of that, they have your next gen science standards and your social studies standards. And then they tell you exactly where within the whole entire ELA package where you would find support to help teach those standards. So as you're laying out what you want to teach for the year, if you know that you have this next gen standard coming up in first trimester, it'll tell you what resources would support that, and then you can go and pull those resources. You don't have to hunt and peck and search. It tells you exactly where to find them, and then you can pull those resources to help kind of intertwine the two. Also, we sort of feel that as you've probably noticed when you look at that curriculum, there's a lot of stuff, and if you were to follow that from beginning to end, you'd probably only be doing language arts, which doesn't work, and your head might be spinning a little bit. So you have to really look at your students' needs and the purpose of what you're teaching. So what essential question are you asking? What themes are you working on? And what of those resources helps you achieve those goals? And then the rest of the stuff that doesn't, that just kind of gets put to the side.
Okay. So I heard about core novel books, about guided reading, and so about this textbook. So how does this what's the vision for all of this to work together? You mentioned that textbook is going to be used as a resource, but how does this all kind of fit with core novel, guided reading, and this resource as a textbook?
Excellent question. It really starts with a year-long map and planning out the skills that you want your students to accomplish, and when it would be timely for them to accomplish those. If you notice on your core book list, there are many core books at different levels now. So you're going to want to be thoughtful about when you teach certain books. You don't want to start with Writing Freedom, which is a level P, at the very beginning of kindergarten. Or I'm sorry, third grade. You're going to want to move to those ends at the beginning. So you're going to want to think about, okay, which resources do I have? What core novels do I have that fit the ability range of my students now? What essential question do I have that I can tie those novels together, or tie my content area standards? And you're going to want to start to try to map those things out. And then again, you're going to need to go back and look at all of it. Okay, this is the map that I've planned for myself. And then you need to think, do I have room for extension and remediation in there if my students aren't getting what I'm teaching, or they already have it and I need to extend? You're also going to want to think, do my standards have some sort of flow that makes sense? Because you don't want everything to be in isolation. You don't want language arts and then math and then science. Students need to understand that's not the way the real world works, and that those things overlap and support each other. So what is it that you're going to use as a common thread to help make those connections for students and for yourself? you know, it's easy for us to get stuck in, I call it perspective land, where we're working with our stuff and we're working with activities and books and worksheets, but then there is no connection amongst those, and we're jumping from perspective to perspective. So you really want to make sure, again, going back with that unit design and backwards planning, that you start first thinking about what would my whole year look like and how could I lay it out in a way that makes sense, and then going down to that unit focus. Okay, how am I going to tie these standards in this trimester together, and then moving on from there.
And I think along those lines of thinking about integration of the content areas, you want to think about integrating those reading skills and strategies as well. So if you've modeled through your Daily 5 and your cafe, if you've modeled a reading strategy, you wouldn't just do it within a confined reading time during your class. You would want to bring up the fact that you're using those strategies and model the use of those strategies when you're reading a social science text or when you're reading a science text, so that students can see how it all blends together and how those skills and strategies that they learn either within guided reading or also through the Daily 5 and Cafe really can be used across the board in all content areas.
I know sometimes there can be some confusion because you have so many materials, like, what do I use for what? So just keep in mind, like for the core novels, use those like, for the whole group. But remember, like for guided reading, we're looking at using books that are at their level, so don't mix the core novels into that, so there won't be that confusion.
Yeah.
So it seems like every piece of this has its function, has its purpose.
Yeah. Exactly.
Right. So, as I got into my grade level, I heard from colleagues about ELD and the difference between integrated ELD and designated ELD. Can you, what's the difference between the two? Can you elaborate on that?
Absolutely. It's funny because as I'm listening to everyone talk, we have our new textbook adoption, and in there it's going to lay out some ELD lessons for you. But I always want to strongly caution you to look at your students and look at the standards. So essentially, if you just were to follow cover to cover, you would cover all the standards. But because it's important to know who your students are and what they need, we really want you to look at the standards, and then you're going to design your lessons based on that. So back to your original question of integrated versus designated, your designated ELD lessons are going to be focused lessons that are protected time, that are designed around those ELD standards, and that's really like a content area time, and you're focused on what does the student need in order to move to the next level of proficiency. So when you look at your English language proficiency descriptors, there are entry and exit descriptors for each of the proficiency levels. And we want you to look at where is my child at and where do they need to go next. So when you're looking at that descriptor, you would say, these are the skills that my students need, and then you would design in your designated time lessons that would support the student's mastery of those standards. The integrated time is basically within all your content areas. You're looking at what language do the students need in order to access this content. So basically it's like the language support that is needed for science or math or even a core novel. And that is for your English learners, all the scaffolding and support that they need in order to access the content. So the two kind of work together because it's all based on the ELD standards, but essentially they have different functions. And as a third grade teacher, as any grade teacher, you're responsible for both integrated and designated. They're not, mutually exclusive. You only have to do one. So the other thing is when you're thinking about your integrated lesson is you want to take whatever your outcome is and say, what skills from the ELD standards does my students need to master along with that in order to produce whatever the product is. So say it's a piece of writing. You could look and say, okay, my students are, I have a level 2 student and they're struggling with like subject-verb agreement. I'm going to give them some sentence frames to help them with that. because they're going to access the content. I want them to do a piece of writing, so I'm going to give them some sentence frames that are going to give that structure so that my students will be successful in producing the product that I want.
And I know that sometimes there's a concern about how to fit in that protected time for that designated ELD. One of the ways that we can address that is sometimes through the guided reading lesson, because that is a place where you are differentiating those skills and strategies that the students need and really being able to focus in on those things in that kind of protected time.
Absolutely.
So in regards to differentiating for English language learners, is there anything else I need to keep in mind for the other students in my classroom?
Yeah, and I like that you bring that up, because just because a student is not struggling doesn't mean that they don't need support, because we know all students need support. It just looks different. So our end goal should always be, regardless of where our students start from, that by the end of the lesson or the experience that everyone should level up, right? And we're providing the appropriate supports for that. So one thing I think is really important to remember when you're differentiating is that our groupings should be flexible. And it should be based on formative assessment that is ongoing and that really responds to the needs of your students. So it's not just one meal for everyone kind of thing. That doesn't mean that we don't have shared experiences, right? Because there needs to be a balance, right? There needs to be a balance between mixed ability group, mixed readiness groups, and also groups based on readiness, and appropriate supports for each of those experiences. I think it's also really important to remember that differentiation doesn't mean less work for students who need more support or who are struggling, or more work for those who already have mastered the standard. It just means different work and the just right work. And then asking the students who've already mastered those standards to dig deeper, to think in more complex ways, and not just give the high achieving or the gifted student more.
And can I add to that? Because I think one of the, fallacies out there with English learners is that, well, they can't do this because of language. But again, language is not a barrier to their thinking. So they are deep thinkers. It's just that sometimes they don't have the language to express their thinking, either in writing or orally. And so it's looking for avenues to differentiate and provide that deep input instructionally, where sometimes we can take some of the language away and make it still accessible. So like a hands-on experience where it's not language dependent, and the student then is growing and learning, and maybe they produce a product to you in their home language, and maybe you ask a colleague or somebody on staff to help you translate it so that they can put out all their thoughts that they have learned and express ideas to you in something that is meaningful to them, but that you can provide again those deep experiences, because some of our students come to you very well educated and maybe even more advanced than what your general class is, but they don't have the language, and so we think, oh well, they don't know, but they do.
And that's something that scares me going into third grade, because I'm going to have probably some of those deep thinkers, those students that might have those skills that I know it all. So how about any scaffolding or enrichment activities for those students who already have mastered that learning objective?
I think it's always important for all our students, but especially for ones who've already mastered the skills, to have them make the connection to the real world, right? So anytime you can create those real world connections, that's really great. Getting them to think in more abstract ways, open-ended ways, even using analogies. There's a power to having a student explain to you how the character in a book is like something abstract, rather than just doing a whole one-page summary report kind of thing. There's a big difference. So I think that's something to kind of keep in mind. And then also having students connect the work to their interests, and giving them avenues to find what their passion is in connection to the content that you're studying. Is always good.
And that's, when we were talking about the 4 Ps earlier and we mentioned inquiry, that is exactly what we're talking about, taking what you're passionate about and moving on in that direction, Because once school ends, learning doesn't stop. And so we need to train our students that, your inquiry and your passion, that's what leads you to learning new things. And it's not just the teacher told me to learn this.
And that's part of that whole lifelong learner. And when we look at 21st century skills, that's what we want kids to leave with, is that readiness to say, I'm interested in this, and I have the tools to go and seek out new information. I don't need to sit in a classroom to find out that this is what we're studying, because this is my passion. And that's how we create these 21st century learners.
Yeah. One of the big shifts, I think, is that in previous ways we assessed our students, it focused on content. Content was king. And now it's not so much that content is king. Of course, it's important, and we have our standards that we need to address. But I think even more than that are those skills that allow you to get to that content, exactly like you were saying. And so if we're focused on inference and inquiry and synthesis and those high-level skills, then we are doing more than just handing somebody content. Because at this point, our students have access to devices and can find out from their device more than I could ever possibly know as a teacher. But my job now is to not worry so much about all those discrete content pieces, but to really think about what skills and processes do I want my students to know and be able to do, so that when I'm not there with them or their teacher's not there with them, they have that ability to learn and to continue growing on their own.
Like Christy was saying earlier too about, I guess like the 4 Ps and the unit design. With our core novels, even with our guided reading, we want the kids to go beyond the book. Mm-hmm. So it's not just like, oh, what color was Johnny's shirt? That's not going to be very important. But the idea, like, okay, something that they can get from the book that can be applied to a greater good or something else, and that can tie into their science or social studies. And then it's like it just goes beyond the book. So it's just more than the little discrete content things.
I think one of the shifts that we've made as well is really, as teachers, relinquishing some of the control over what students are doing and really helping students to develop independence, so that, like through the Daily 5, we're giving them book choice and allowing them to choose books that interest them. And even in some of the extensions that we do with core novels and things like that there is a little bit of room for choice and making different decisions for themselves about what they're passionate about and developing that. So I know that sometimes is hard for us as teachers to let go of some of that, but I think that's a huge shift that we need to make.
Something that you can do that can help you with that is to always ask yourself who's doing the work.
Yes.
Whatever activity it is or whatever it is that you're doing in class, who's really doing the work? And if you're going home exhausted at the end of every day, chances are you're doing more work than they are. And so really shifting that cognitive demand to your students rather than yourself.
I love the way that everyone is, I think a common theme in our conversation today is how you can use what we have and the structures that we have already, not just to create something more or creating an individual plan for every single student, because that's not practical. But I think that you can differentiate things within the Daily 5 and cafe structure, and then also, using Correlate and everything like that, so, and guided reading. So I think that's a really good way.
I know this is going to be a shift for me to go through new grade level, but I just want to thank you all for supporting me and answering my questions on this journey. So thank you very much.
You're welcome. And just remember, every step of the way, you have lots of experts in all these individual fields, and that's our job, is to help you fit those pieces together. So remember that you don't have to go into your classroom and do it all alone, that you have the support of us and your colleagues when you need it.